Thinking back on my high school days now feels like remembering a different lifetime. I was just a regular kid, navigating the maze of friendships, figuring out who I was, and dealing with the rush of first love. My parents were great, always supportive, but busy. That left me with a lot of time alone to wrestle with life's bigger questions. I was always thinking about things, and looking back, that was both a blessing and a curse. It definitely shaped me in ways I didn't expect. During that time, I had my first serious crush. I became obsessed with a girl who seemed like she embodied everything I wanted. She was the captain of the dance team, and I was convinced we were meant to be. We spent every day together, inseparable, until one night in early June when I saw her out with another guy. It destroyed me. I was so crushed that I spent hours driving around, my mind going to dark places, even considering wrapping my car around a tree. Eventually, I made my way home, hoping my parents would help me make sense of it all. But they weren't home, and the loneliness hit me like a truck. In a moment of desperation, I thought about grabbing the gun from my dad's safe, but it was locked, thankfully. Now, looking back, I realize how foolish and dramatic my teenage mind was. What seemed like the end of the world then feels insignificant now. I fell asleep waiting for my parents and woke up to a beautiful spring morning, filled with embarrassment for my thoughts the night before. We had a long talk when they got back, and it gave me a new perspective. I never talked to that girl again, even though she tried to apologize. I didn't ask for the pricey bracelet I had gifted her either. A week later, she showed up at my house, but my grandma, who was visiting at the time, sent her away, telling her I'd moved on. When prom came around, she went with the other guy. I don't know how their night turned out, but I have a sneaking suspicion that the sugar in his gas tank didn't make it easy for them. That whole experience changed me. It made me more closed off in relationships. Fast forward a few years, and I was married to someone amazing, Katie. We were happy for a long time until one strange day. I had ordered a book online, just a used mystery novel, and Katie found a note tucked inside. She was confused, holding up a piece of paper with delicate handwriting on it. The note read, "Nick, you need to leave that crazy wife of yours before she ruins your life. I'll wait for you, but not forever. Love, Sarah. P.S. I hope to see the divorce papers signed soon." I was completely blindsided. Katie thought it was a message from another woman, but I had no idea where it came from. The book wasn't even mine. I had just bought it online. But what were the odds that the previous owner was also named Nick? The timing couldn't have been worse. A year earlier, I had made a huge mistake of getting too friendly with a colleague at work, Rachel. We flirted, went out to dinner a few times, and even though she suggested we take it further, I knew deep down it was a bad idea. My marriage to Katie wasn't in the best place, but I loved her, and I wanted to fix things. That night, I came clean to Katie about how distant we had become and confessed that I had come close to making a big mistake with Rachel. It took weeks of tough conversations and plenty of convincing, but Katie eventually believed I was committed to making things right. Things were starting to get back on track, but then she found that note in the book, and all the trust we had rebuilt came crashing down. On top of that, I had been working extra hours at my job, trying to secure a big promotion. Katie wasn't happy about it, especially since her parents had never really liked me. She was also spending more time at their house, and I could feel the tension building between us. We had a huge fight one night after I made the mistake of calling her mother a piece of work, and it just so happened that the note she found used similar words. That only made things worse. You're probably thinking I should have just given up, but I swear I didn't write that note. Katie didn't believe me, though, and after another big argument, she locked me out of our bedroom. The next day, I told my boss I needed to scale back my hours at work. He understood, having gone through a rough divorce himself. I picked up flowers on my way home, hoping to make peace with Katie. She accepted them, but there was still this coldness between us. By Friday night, things were still tense. Katie decided to spend the weekend at her parents' house. I begged her not to go, knowing her mother's influence would only make things worse, but she insisted she needed some time to think. So, I stayed behind with our dog, Baxter, taking long walks and thinking about how to fix our relationship. On Saturday night, I texted her, "Would you consider counseling?" Her reply was short, "We'll talk when I get back Sunday night." When Sunday came, she messaged me again, saying she'd had too much wine with dinner and would be back Monday instead. I was growing frustrated, knowing that her weekend with her mother had likely made things even harder between us. Monday morning came, and she returned home just as I was about to head to work. She gave me a quick kiss and told me, "We'll talk tonight." Before rushing upstairs to get ready, I decided to surprise her by picking up Chinese takeout for dinner, hoping a nice meal might break the ice. But when we sat down to eat, the silence was thick and awkward. After dinner, she finally spoke. "Nick, I don't trust you anymore. And that's not how I should feel about my husband. My mom thinks I should leave." I cut in, frustrated. "Can we stop bringing your mom into this? This is about us." "I need space," she said, ignoring my plea. "I think you should sleep in the spare room until we figure this out." I hated the idea. How is sleeping apart going to help? Maybe we'll try counseling, but not right now. I just need time. I couldn't help but ask, "Does this time you need include more advice from your mom?" She shot me a look. "My mom wants what's best for me. If I need to talk to her, I will." And that was the end of the conversation. I moved into the spare bedroom that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how things had gone so wrong. It made me think back to when I first met Katie. I was fresh out of business school, working at a consulting firm, and she was interning for a nonprofit. We clicked immediately, but now, it felt like we were worlds apart. I had been assigned to work with a nonprofit organization to help them upgrade their outdated computer systems. Everything went smoothly. The NGO got a brand new server, and I ended up meeting my future wife. Katie was about to start her final year at Columbia, and we spent that summer inseparable. She was intelligent, driven, and had the kind of beauty that could easily land her in magazines. Despite her wealthy upbringing, Katie treated everyone with the same warmth, from the janitors to the CEO. Physically, we were a great match, but socially, we came from very different places. She was the only child of a rich family, while I was one of 4 kids from a middle-class household. My mom worked as a third-grade teacher, and my dad ran his own auto repair shop. I had gone to Ohio State for undergrad before earning my MBA at the University of Michigan. After graduation, I got a job at Horizon Tech Solutions, where I'm now a project manager, leading the team responsible for migrating our systems to the cloud. Tuesday morning, I woke up alone in the spare room, still adjusting to the new reality of our strained relationship. After shaking off the sleep, I went downstairs and found a fresh pot of coffee waiting, something Katie still did for me despite the tension between us. I thought about joining her in the shower, like we used to, but I decided to give her the space she asked for. Instead, I drank my coffee and got ready for work in the guest bathroom. The distance between us lasted all week. Katie had been working long hours, so I threw myself into my project, which seemed to impress my boss. On Friday, I sent her a text, trying to break the ice. "How about dinner tonight?" "Your choice. I'll take you anywhere." 10 minutes later, her response came, "Going to my mom's for the weekend. Need some space." Frustrated, I called her. "How are we supposed to fix anything if you keep leaving?" "Nick, I told you I need time," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's only been a week. You have to respect that." I tried to convince her to stay, but she wouldn't budge. At least she agreed to consider marriage counseling, though. "Will I see you before you head to New York tonight?" I asked, hoping to at least talk in person. "No, I'm already packed. I'll probably be back Monday night, but I'm going straight to work when I get back." So, it was another lonely weekend with our dog, Baxter, giving me too much time to think. On Saturday, I came up with an idea. I called the used bookstore where I had bought The Wrong Man, the book that had caused so much chaos, and asked to speak to someone. "Hi, I bought a book from your store a few weeks back, and inside it, I found a note. A romantic note meant for some guy named Nick. My wife found it, and now thinks I'm having an affair. I really need to track down the original owner of that book." The guy on the other end laughed. "Man, what are the odds? A book called The Wrong Man, owned by 2 guys named Nick, and a love note to top it off? That's wild. Look, this isn't a joke. My wife is ready to leave me over this, and I need you to check your system to see if the previous owner is in your records." He hesitated. "We can track sellers if they have an account, but I can't just give out personal information." "Okay, fine, but could you at least contact him and ask him to call me?" This is important. Sure. What's your name? He asked. Nick. He chuckled again. Like the author? I was confused. What author? Nick Parker, the mystery writer. I sighed. No, it's Nicholas Parker. I'm not an author, just a guy trying to clear his name. I gave him my number, and surprisingly, my phone rang about 20 minutes later. The guy on the other end introduced himself as Nick, the Nick who had owned the book before me. Hey, I heard you found a note meant for me, he said cautiously. This isn't some kind of blackmail, is it? No, man, nothing like that. I found a note in the book from a woman named Jess, and now my wife thinks I'm involved in something. I need you to tell her it was meant for you. Nick let out a long sigh. Damn, I've been looking for that note everywhere. If my wife had found it, I'd be in serious trouble. Well, now it's causing me serious trouble. Can you help me out here? No way, man. I'm not getting involved. I dodged that bullet, and I'm not about to throw myself back into it. And with that, he hung up. Frustrated, I took a minute to cool off before calling him back. Nick, it's Nick again. Listen, if you don't send me a notarized letter saying that note was from Jess to you, I'll make sure your wife gets a copy of it. How does that sound? There was a long pause. Damn, that's cold. Not as cold as it's been around here since my wife found the note. Finally, he relented. Fine, I'll send the letter. But after that, we're done. Got it? Agreed. Just get it to me ASAP. I gave him my address and hoped that would be the end of it. Katie and I had gotten serious quickly. Just 5 weeks into dating, we were already talking about the future, and by the end of that summer, we were exclusive. During her senior year, I made the hour-and-a-half drive to see her in New York City as often as I could. We spent Thanksgiving at her parents' high-rise apartment in the Upper East Side. Her mom had always been distant, but I figured I'd win her over eventually. Katie came home with me for Christmas, and my family loved her, treating her like one of their own. Her parents, though, clearly thought our relationship was just another phase. They expected it to fizzle out like her previous flings. But when I proposed and Katie said yes, it became clear that we were serious. We settled in New Jersey, which was close enough to the city for her parents to stay involved in our lives. As we prepared for the wedding, though, her mother made several attempts to drive a wedge between us. Katie stood her ground, but I didn't realize how much damage her mother's influence had done until much later. I found myself torn between focusing on my career to impress her parents and making time for my relationship with Katie, a tough balance many young couples face. When Katie came back from her parents' house that Monday, the distance between us hadn't lessened. I decided to wait until I received the letter from the other Nick before trying to talk things through. For now, I stayed in the guest room, desperate to make things right. That's when I did something I'd promised myself I'd never do. I went through her emails while she was in the shower. I copied all of the emails onto an external drive. Reading through them only confirmed what I had feared. Katie's mother was actively trying to turn her against me. She was encouraging Katie to move to New York and transfer to her company's office there. There was also a message from a guy named Brad Carson, someone who was clearly trying to stay close to Katie despite the strain in our relationship. But there was a silver lining, Katie's responses. She expressed love for me and a desire to fix things between us, despite her mom's constant interference. That gave me some hope. Later that evening, I received a notarized letter from the other Nick, confirming that he was the one who had written the note I'd found in the book. When Katie came home, I had dinner ready and waiting for her. After we ate, I handed her the letter, and her face softened as she read it. She came over, sat on my lap, kissed me, and whispered, "This makes me happy, Nick. Almost as happy as having you back in my arms." We finally had a long conversation. Katie opened up about feeling like she was just a prop in her parents' lives, especially her mom's. She explained how her mother had been trying to rebuild their relationship recently, even giving her advice that I couldn't believe. Her mom had told her not to start a family, claiming it would ruin her career, just like she believed having Katie had ruined hers. I was floored. Katie and I had talked about having kids just last year, but now it was clear her mom was driving a wedge between us. When I asked Katie if there was someone else in her life, she assured me she would never cheat. Still, I was uneasy about her spending so many weekends in New York. I suggested we take a trip together, maybe get away from everything for a while. But Katie declined, saying her mom had already invited her to see the Phantom of the Opera that weekend. Disappointed, I agreed to push back our getaway. By Thursday, I made a bold and reckless decision. I sent fake emails to both her mother and Brad, emails embedded with viruses that would let me hack into their computers and monitor their correspondence. It was risky, but I felt like I had no other choice. I had to know what was really going on behind the scenes. Looking back, I started to realize how much control Katie's mom had always had over our lives. Even our wedding had felt more like a high society event than a celebration of love. Her mother, Margaret Taylor, spared no expense, throwing a lavish affair that felt more like a gala than a wedding. My family kept it simple, but Margaret invited every influential person she knew. The whole thing had felt staged. Still, the first few years of our marriage had been good. We found a nice balance between work and fun. Living in the suburbs, far enough from her parents, gave us peace. We even got a dog, Baxter, and started talking about having kids. But just when we were ready to start a family, things began to unravel. That Thursday night, both Brad and Margaret opened the fake emails, and I gained access to their inboxes. What I discovered was shocking. Brad wasn't just some random friend. He was having an affair with Katie's mother, and to make things worse, they were scheming to set him up with Katie, hoping to break up our marriage in the process. Despite the betrayal, I knew I had to deal with the situation directly. After dropping Baxter off at the kennel, I caught the Amtrak to New York, determined to save my marriage. I had a plan. When I got there, I bought a cheap baseball cap, a disposable camera, and staked out her parents' upscale brownstone. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew I needed answers. As I waited across the street, a woman approached me. She must have noticed I was watching the building because she said, "You look like you could use some help." She introduced herself as a private investigator. Surprised, I accepted her offer. "I'll help you out," she said. "If Katie and Brad meet, I'll snap some photos for you." What had started as a simple stakeout quickly turned into something much more complicated. "This neighborhood's full of rich folks with skeletons in their closets," she said with a smirk. "I'm here every night, watching that building next door. A lawyer's wife hired me to catch him sneaking around with his mistress." She extended her hand. "I'm Karen Withers, by the way." We shook hands, and as Karen talked, I kept my eyes fixed on Katie's building. Soon, I saw her walk out, arm in arm with a man I assumed was Brad. "There they are," Karen said quietly, snapping photos as they got into a cab. "Got them. Now what?" I asked, feeling my stomach churn. "Now I keep watching the lawyer. But if you want more photos when they come back, it'll be another $100, she said, her tone matter of fact. "Give me your email, and I'll send you what I've got." I handed her my card, and we sat on a nearby bench to wait. "For another $300, I can dig up everything you'd need to know about Brad. But we'll need to sign a contract for that. Do you work for an agency?" I asked, curious. "I'm freelancing tonight. I do contract work for an agency, but I'm on my own for this one." I texted Karen my email and Brad's full name. As we waited, we chatted more, and I ended up telling her the whole story of my marriage, from the start to where things had gone wrong. "How did you become a PI?" I asked, curious about her background. She laughed. "I spent 15 years on the NYPD, 6 of them in counterterrorism. But after I got shot in the leg, lost everything below the knee, I had to go on disability." She pulled up her pant leg, revealing a prosthetic. "Now, I use what I learned to make a living on my own terms. I don't usually work weekends, but I'm doing a favor for a friend tonight." As Karen talked, she snapped a few more photos of a couple getting into a limo across the street. "Are you going to follow them?" I asked. "Nah, it's too risky. I'll grab a bite nearby and wait for them to come back. Most of these rich types just go out for dinner and then head back to whatever place they're using to meet up. There's not much romance in this business." I frowned. What do these women get out of it, besides dinner? More than you'd think. Some of these women make as much as a well-paid assistant. It's sad what some people are willing to sell their dignity for. "And the wives?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "Wives are half our business," Karen said with a sigh. "Some poor guy works 60 hours a week, and meanwhile, someone else is sleeping with his wife. The worst is when DNA tests show the kids aren't even his. Those cases end ugly. I had one client who, well, let's just say it didn't end well. We sat in silence for a moment. I wasn't planning on doing anything drastic, but I couldn't help but think about how much I'd miss Katie if we got divorced. If you're grabbing a bite, mind if I join you? I asked, hoping for some company. Karen shook her head. Nick, go home. You need to figure this out with your wife. I'm meeting my husband at the diner, Karen said, glancing at her watch. He'll be here in about 10 minutes. That's when I noticed her wedding ring for the first time. What a detective I was, missing something so obvious. As we walked, I realized I had a slight limp, my body showing the toll of stress. Wanting to shift the conversation away from my problems, I asked, does this work ever affect your marriage? It affects some of my colleagues, she admitted, but I'm lucky. My husband, Bill, understands the job. He makes sure I know I'm loved. Like tonight, he arranged for his mom to watch the kids so we could have dinner. As we neared the diner, I spotted a tall, athletic man waiting outside. He was about my height, but definitely more built. Karen hugged him tightly, and he kissed her, his eyes flicking toward me. Bill, this is Nick, my new client, Karen introduced us. Nick, meet my husband, Bill. We shook hands, both offering firm but respectful grips. Football player? I guessed, noticing his broad shoulders. He grinned. Close. I was a wrestler at Ohio State. You? Nah, no sports for me. I was more of a bookworm. Bill chuckled, then turned to Karen. Ready to eat? I declined their offer to join them. I've got to get back to the train station, I said. Karen, just send me the contract when you can. I'll sign it and take care of the payment. Thanks for handling my case. Karen laughed. Is that the right word? She teased, but I shook Bill's hand again. It was a pleasure meeting you, Bill. You're a lucky guy, but honestly, I think you're both lucky. Thanks for inviting me, even if it was short-lived. You've given me some hope. Bill glanced at Karen, who whispered something in his ear. I smiled and walked away, feeling slightly better about the mess I was in. Sunday morning, I overslept, trying to recover from the emotional roller coaster of the past few days. After making coffee, I powered up my laptop and immediately started downloading Brad's archived emails. I decided not to wait for Karen to call. I needed answers now. With a cup of coffee and a bagel, I dove into Brad Carson's inbox. It didn't take long to realize that he was a manipulative sleazebag. Margaret Taylor wasn't the only married woman he'd been seeing. And then, in his sent folder, I found an email that put everything into perspective. Dennis, it's time to cash in that favor. I've been stringing along this uptight socialite for the last few months. She only gives me the time of day because I've got the so-called right background. Little does she know, my father cut me off years ago. You're probably wondering why I'm even bothering with her. Well, here's why. Her daughter is gorgeous, and the old lady is trying to wreck her marriage so she can pair me up with her. She thinks we can keep seeing each other without anyone catching on. Can you believe that? Oh, and by the way, she's worth millions. I'm sending you a burner phone. When I call, just pretend to be my father. You owe me from last year. Don't mess this up. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Part of me felt sorry for Margaret, but only for a second. This was way more complicated than I could handle alone. I hoped Karen would have some ideas on how to move forward. As I continued going through the emails, I even managed to get access to Brad's bank account information. It was unsettling how easy it had been, and by early afternoon, I couldn't wait any longer. I called Karen. Hey Nick, I figured you'd call today, she answered. Sorry to bother you on a Sunday, I said, feeling guilty. Please apologize to Bill and the kids, but I need to know what happened after I left last night. You'll be happy to hear that your wife got home around 10 p.m. She and Brad took a cab back to her parents' place. He tried to get her to invite him in, but she refused. He even went for a kiss, but she turned her head, and he only got her cheek. The doorman wouldn't let him in either, so Brad left, looking pretty frustrated. Your wife didn't cave in to his advances, and she got home at a decent hour. But yeah, going out with him in the first place wasn't great. I let out a deep breath. It was a relief to know that Katie hadn't crossed any serious lines with Brad, but I was still angry about how broken our marriage had become. Remember what we talked about, Karen added. Her mother set this all in motion. It doesn't make everything okay, but it explains a lot. Yeah, but you won't believe what I found out today, I said. Turns out Brad isn't just after my wife. He's involved with Margaret too. And she's actively trying to ruin our marriage just to keep him around. Wow, that's ice cold, Karen said, sounding genuinely shocked. I've seen a lot in this line of work, but people's cruelty still gets to me sometimes. How did you find all this out? I hesitated for a moment. If I tell you, is there some sort of client PI confidentiality? Not exactly, she said. If I'm subpoenaed, I have to tell the truth. So, if it's illegal, you need to think about whether you want to share it. After a moment's pause, I told her the truth. I explained how I'd hacked into Brad's emails and bank accounts. Karen was stunned by what I had done, but she listened carefully. You can really access this guy's passwords and see everything he's doing? She asked, still surprised. Yeah, I replied. Maybe later this week you can teach me how to protect myself from people like, well, me. Karen laughed. I might just take you up on that offer. But for now, I'm heading back to my family. We're watching The Wizard of Oz, and my kids are giving me the, when are you getting off the phone? Look. Got it, I said, smiling. Thanks, Karen. Call me tomorrow after you dig up more on Brad's background, and I'll fill you in on the rest. We hung up, and I spent the rest of the afternoon combing through more of Brad and Margaret's emails. By the time Sunday evening rolled around, I was still glued to the screen. That's when Katie walked back through the door. I had gathered a lot of information, but I was clueless about how to use it. My belongings were still in the guest room when Katie stormed into the kitchen, where I sat nursing a beer. Nick, where are your clothes? She demanded. I ignored her question. How was your date last night? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Her face flashed with guilt, shock, and confusion all at once. What are you talking about? I didn't go on a date, she replied with such conviction that I might have believed her if I hadn't seen her with my own eyes, climbing into that cab with Brad. What do you call going to a play with another man? You might want to check the definition. There it was again, that look. Were you following me? She asked, her voice shaking. Doesn't matter. I went into the city yesterday to surprise you and your mom. I thought I'd convince you both that I should take you to the play myself. Instead, I got there just in time to see you leaving with some guy in a cab. So, who was it? I lied, but it sounded believable. I didn't want Katie to know what I really knew. Nick, my mom got sick at the last minute. A friend of my parents drove me. Nothing happened. I feigned ignorance. And who is this friendly chauffeur? Does he have a name? Brad Carson. He works for my dad, she said, hesitating. I pressed on. Katie, this is getting ridiculous. Your parents are trying to tear us apart, and you're letting them. I'd bet you $1,000 that your mom miraculously recovered by Sunday. This whole illness was staged. And isn't it convenient that Brad just happened to be free at the last minute? Our marriage is hanging by a thread, and you're blind to it. Katie looked stunned, like I had slapped her. I didn't want the argument to escalate any further, so I stood up and left the kitchen, retreating to the guest room. It was another sleepless night, and I ended up heading to the office early, arriving before 7 a.m. At 8, I got a notification on my phone. Katie had sent 2 texts to Sharon Roberts. I figured she'd already talked to her mom, and Margaret was probably filling her head with more nonsense. My marriage was unraveling fast. Late Monday night, Karen called while I was still at work. Are you somewhere private? She asked. I shut my office door. Yeah, what's going on? First, remind me, what's Brad Carson's role at the bank? I've been focusing on his extracurricular activities. I glanced at my notes. From what I've gathered, he's a personal banker. He handles trust accounts and money management for high-end clients. Yesterday, I saw him set up wire transfers for 2 clients. I'll verify the transactions later at home. I don't want to risk using my work computer. Did any of those transfers go to foreign banks? Karen asked. One did. It was for a wealthy kid's tuition and living expenses in France. Karen paused. I've got some dirt on Brad. He had a major falling out in college. Bad enough that his family cut ties with him. He moved to New York to leave his past behind. I also spoke to a contact in the NYPD. Last year, Brad's college buddy, Dennis Riley, stayed with him for a weekend. They picked up a girl at a bar. She got drunk, And when Riley tried to assault her, Brad did nothing to stop it. In fact, when she reported it, Riley claimed it was consensual, and Brad backed him up, saying the girl had even hit on him. The case was dropped because it was 2 against 1, and Riley walked away without consequences. Because Brad lied for him, I muttered. Exactly. I read the first line of Brad's email to Dennis, the one you found. Karen paused. Looks like Riley owes him big time for covering for him. Now, how do you feel about getting back at both of them? One's a rapist, and the other's his enabler. No question about it. What's the plan? You said you could access Brad's computer. How good are you at this? Could you use his identity to open foreign accounts and transfer his clients' money? I know how to get into his computer, but I'm not an expert at opening accounts, and I'm not interested in stealing money. If we do it right, no one will actually lose any money. But we should talk in person. Can you meet tomorrow night? I'd like to bring a friend. I hesitated. Karen, I have to ask, why are you doing all of this without expecting more payment? I agreed to pay you a few thousand to watch Katie and dig up dirt on Brad. Now we're talking about opening accounts and making transfers. What's in it for you? I can't afford to pay you more, and I definitely can't afford to get caught. Karen's voice softened. This is personal, Nick. Years ago, someone drugged and assaulted me. I was too ashamed to report it right away, and by the time I did, there was no evidence left. I filed a complaint, but nothing came of it because it was just my word against his. So, I'm doing this for that girl Riley attacked. She deserves to know that not every guy like him gets away with it. And Brad? He's going down for enabling it. They're both trash. Her words hit me hard. I hadn't known Karen long, but hearing her story made me want to take those two down even more. My grandmother used to say, sometimes, doing the right thing means taking risks, even if it means bending the law. I was ready to do just that. Before we ended the call, Karen asked me to send her everything I'd gathered on Brad, bank accounts, loans, mortgages, all of it. I promised to get it to her by that night, and we agreed to meet Tuesday. I made up an excuse to Katie about working late, though it didn't really matter. We were barely talking and still sleeping in separate rooms by that point. Tuesday night couldn't come fast enough. I met Karen at a quiet pub, and she brought along a friend named Hank. From the way Hank carried himself, I figured he had some kind of intelligence background, probably from one of the agencies. After I explained that I had access to Brad Carson's computer and his banking systems, they laid out the plan. First, we'd buy a plane ticket to Dubai using Brad's credit card. Then, we'd open a bank account in Dubai under his name. Dubai is a popular place for stashing illicit funds, especially after Switzerland's banks got into trouble with the U.S. Treasury. Next, we'd schedule wire transfers of several $1 million to that account for early the next day. I interrupted. No stealing. Hank reassured me. Don't worry. None of the money will actually leave the U.S. We'll make a small error in the transfer instructions that will delay it, making it look like Brad tried to steal the money but messed up. I thought for a moment and then nodded. Okay, what's next? Brad has a line of credit with over $100,000 available, plus $60,000 in a brokerage account, Hank continued. We'll transfer those funds to the Dubai account, and those transfers will go through. Is that a problem? Not if it's his own money, I agreed. Good. Once his funds are drained, Brad won't be able to afford a high-powered lawyer, which will help us take down his buddy Dennis Riley, Karen added. And the final step? We send a fake letter from Brad to Dennis. Here, read this. She handed me a letter. Dennis, forget about these rich old women. I've got bigger plans. By tomorrow, I'll have enough money to last for a while, at least until I find another target. I'm leaving the country. Nothing here is worth sticking around for. I got a call today from an investigator asking about that incident last year. You should have learned your lesson at USC, like I did. Make sure to get approval before you try pulling something like that again. I won't be around to cover for you this time. I'll let you know where I end up, but the feds will be monitoring this email after tomorrow, so don't respond. I'll delete this as soon as I send it. After reading, I smiled. You nailed his tone, especially the arrogance and sleaze. Karen replied, I also found out why Brad's family disowned him. He and another guy attacked a girl at USC. She had a reputation, and after the assault, she took her own life. The family paid off her parents to keep it quiet and cut ties with Brad. This wasn't the first time they had bailed him out. Hearing that only strengthened my resolve to take Brad and Dennis down. Okay, I can handle everything with Hank's guidance. But we need to make sure Brad is at home and not on his computer when this goes down. How do we do that? Don't worry, Brad will be distracted, Karen assured me. We've got that covered. Can we do it tomorrow night? I asked. No problem, Hank replied. The plan is to have Brad arrested early Thursday morning before he has the chance to act. It'll look like he was about to flee the country. It's a pleasure working with professionals, I said, feeling a sense of relief. Karen and Hank were indeed professionals. With Hank's help, everything went off without a hitch. Brad's credit card was used to buy a first-class ticket to Dubai, and a new bank account was opened under his name. His line of credit and brokerage accounts were set up to funnel money into the Dubai account. The wire transfers were ready to go, but the major transfer was deliberately botched, ensuring it wouldn't go through. To guarantee Brad stayed at his apartment all night, Karen and Hank employed an expensive escort, a tactic that Hank had likely picked up during his intelligence days. The escort bumped into Brad after work, convincing him to grab a drink with her. Brad, full of himself, thought his charm had won her over and ended up taking her back to his apartment for another drink. The woman, experienced in manipulation, told Brad that she'd been mistreated by a man before and wouldn't let it happen again. She demanded to see his ID. Brad, thinking with his ego, shrugged and handed over his driver's license. Sensing she could get more, she asked for his passport. Without questioning her reasoning, Brad fetched it from his office. She flipped through the pages, making small talk about his travels before setting the passport down and leading him to bed. At 8 a.m. Thursday morning, Brad opened his door to find two detectives waiting for him. Despite his protests of innocence, he was quickly arrested. One of the detectives noticed the passport lying on the table and asked, "Planning a trip, Mr. Carson?" as they cuffed him. Brad knew he had been set up, but he had no idea by whom or how. All traces of the viruses on his and Margaret's computers had been wiped clean. I had sent a command to erase Brad's hard drive before the police arrived, making it seem like he had done it to cover his tracks. The police eventually retrieved copies of Brad's emails, including one where he admitted to lying about Dennis Riley's assault case and another outlining his plan to flee the country with stolen money. Thanks to Karen's contacts, the police offered Brad a deal, testify against Dennis Riley, and they dropped the false statement charges. True to his nature, Brad took the deal, leading to Dennis's extradition. Once Dennis learned about Brad's betrayal, the two turned on each other, tearing each other apart in court. Brad received no support from his family this time. Despite his attempts to claim innocence, he was convicted of theft and related charges, sentenced to 4 years in prison. Dennis, with Brad's damning testimony, got 10 years. By the time the trial ended, the two despised each other. Brad's testimony was the final nail in Dennis's coffin. I had personal matters to attend to the day after Brad's arrest. I arranged a meeting with my father-in-law, Mr. Taylor. "I have some things that could hurt Katie if she sees them," I began. "But I think it's better if you decide what to do with them." I handed Jonathan a folder of Margaret's emails to Brad, making no mention of how I had obtained them. He opened the folder and read slowly, only pausing to pour us both coffee. I was surprised that he made it himself instead of calling for help. When he finished, he looked at me, clearly troubled. "I asked you not to hurt my daughter," he said quietly. "Knowing her mother used her like this would devastate Katie." "Then don't show her," I replied. "I promise I won't bring it up during the divorce." Jonathan's face tightened. "So you plan to divorce Katie?" he asked. "That would hurt her just as much." "That's not really my choice," I said. "Your wife is determined to end our marriage, and she's convinced Katie it's the right thing to do." He nodded slightly, then added, "Call me Jack?" His request caught me off guard. "Tell me more," he continued. "I don't understand how Margaret got such control over Katie." I explained, "Margaret's been telling Katie she gave up her career for her, that she was too young when she got married and had Katie, and that you stopped her from pursuing her dreams. She's been piling guilt on Katie for years." Jack listened carefully. "Katie feels like she never had a real connection with either of you," I said. "Seeing how my family interacts made her realize something was missing." When Margaret finally started paying attention to her, Katie jumped at the chance to feel close to her. Jack was hard to read, but after a moment, he spoke candidly. Do you know what it's like to turn 60 and realize your life is a mess? No, I don't, I admitted. I'm just venting, Jack said, shaking his head. Margaret claims she gave up her career. What a joke. The only things she's pursued are manicures and spa treatments. She always talked about being a professional tennis player, but after years of lessons, she still can't hit a decent backhand. He sighed. I've spent most of my life building this bank, working long hours to make it successful. That's how I was raised. We didn't expect to be best friends with our wives. We focused on business. I spent more time with my golf buddies than my family because that's what Margaret wanted. But until today, I had no proof she was cheating. I was blissfully ignorant. His honesty caught me off guard. I'm sorry I had to be the one to bring this to your attention, I said. No, Nick, I'm grateful you did. An affair is one thing, but sacrificing Katie's happiness to keep her lover around? Especially with one of my employees? He shook his head. Brad was walking around the office smug, knowing he was with my wife. Well, he won't be for a while. He was arrested this morning for theft and providing false information in a criminal case. If what we've heard from the police is true, Brad Carson will be out of the picture for a long time. Jack took a sip of his coffee before continuing. As for Margaret, she has her own trust fund worth millions, which will help me during the divorce. She'll probably be lounging at the spa or playing tennis, shedding crocodile tears. Some new guy will scoop her up, and I'll be easily replaced. She'll lose some social standing. Other wives will avoid her to protect their own marriages. And she'll lose her relationship with Katie, but based on what's in that folder, he held it up, she probably won't care too much about that. Jack paused, looking more reflective. And Katie, he said softly, I wonder if it's too late to fix things with my daughter. I do love her, but I let Margaret control that relationship too. That's another thing I owe Margaret for. Somehow, I'll make her pay for all the damage she's caused. Maybe not right away, but eventually. He sighed again. In the meantime, Nick, I need your help. You say you love Katie. Do you think you can fix your marriage? I hesitated. I don't know, Jack. Logically, I understand it's not entirely her fault. She was manipulated by her mother. And it helps knowing she didn't sleep with Brad. At least, I don't think so. But emotionally, that's the hard part. I'm not like you. I just handed you proof of your wife's infidelity, and you didn't shed a tear. You were calm, maybe a little angry, but in control. When Katie left that second weekend, I cried for the first time in my adult life. I don't know how you do it. Jonathan Taylor looked at me for a long moment before responding. Because I've been bottling up my emotions for over 40 years, he said. Let me tell you a story not many people know. Right after college, I enrolled in Navy flight school. It was tough, but I made it. I was so proud the day I got those stripes on my uniform in front of my parents. But then, my life fell apart. I crashed, broke both legs and my back. Worse, my radar intercept officer, Ted Andrews, didn't make it. I spent 6 weeks in the hospital, and when I could walk again, I went to apologize to Ted's parents. I'll never forget the look on their faces, seeing the man responsible for their son's death. I cried for days after that. The Navy discharged me, and I went home. My parents were kind. They didn't blame me. They sent me to Harvard for my MBA, hoping I could move on. But not a week goes by that I don't think about what I could have done differently. It wasn't because I was drunk or hungover. It was just a mistake, but it cost a man his life. Ted's parents never wanted to hear from me again, and I don't blame them. But part of my life has been dedicated to his memory. I donate $110,000 every year to the USO and a fund for wounded soldiers, Jack said, his voice steady. After all that, dealing with an unfaithful wife seems small by comparison. I listened quietly, watching a man who had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. There was something about his story that hit me deeply, and I realized there might be a way to help lighten that load for him. Reflecting on my relationship with Katie, I couldn't help but think about how out of character her recent behavior had been. It was clear that much of it stemmed from her desperate attempt to finally connect with a mother who had never truly shown her love. My thoughts drifted back to the first time I met Katie, 8 years ago, during my work with the NGO. It was a warm afternoon, and I had just finished a long day at the office. While walking through Columbus Square, I spotted her sitting alone on a bench, looking like she could use a friend. I approached her, introduced myself, and struck up a conversation. "Excuse me, I've seen you at the office. I'm Nick Parker from IT, I said, extending my hand. She recognized me, but I could tell she had been crying. Still, instead of brushing me off, she offered a faint smile. "Yes, I've seen you too. I'm Katie Taylor." She shook my hand, her grip gentle but firm. "May I sit down, or would you prefer to be alone?" I asked cautiously. "No, please sit," she replied. Taking a chance, I asked, "It's obvious you've been crying. Do you want to talk about it?" Katie hesitated before responding. "Did you hear the news about the 2 girls in Sudan?" she asked. Our NGO supported schools in Sudan, as well as in other parts of Africa and the Middle East. The girls we helped were taught reading, writing, domestic skills, and health education, subjects that didn't always sit well with local communities. "No, I've been stuck in the server room all day," I replied. "Yesterday in Juba, 2 sisters were dragged out of class by their grandparents. They were angry that the girls' parents allowed them to be educated. They accused the parents of turning the girls against Allah. This morning, we heard the sisters had been mutilated. Their clitorises were removed with the local imam's approval." I was speechless. I had heard about such practices before, but hearing it firsthand was something else. Katie continued, "I can't understand how people who claim to follow God can believe it's right to destroy what He created." She paused, then asked, "Are we really helping, or are we just making things worse?" "I don't have the answers," I admitted. "But my grandmother used to tell me something when I was a kid. During a big storm on my grandparents' farm, we saw a funnel cloud coming, and we had to corral the chickens into the barn. We got most of them inside, but then my grandpa told me to head to the basement. I didn't understand why we were leaving the rest behind, but Grandma explained it to me. She said, if you try to save everyone, you might end up saving no one." Katie looked at me with those beautiful, tear-filled eyes, listening intently. "I think you could apply that to what your organization does. Save as many girls as you can from a hopeless life. You won't save them all, but don't lose sight of the good you're doing." "Your grandmother sounds wise," Katie said softly. "But why do you say your organization? Don't you work for the NGO?" "Not exactly," I replied. "I'm with KPMG, under contract to upgrade their systems. Once this project is done, I'll move on to another assignment. That's the life of a consultant. 2 months from now, I could be in California or Virginia. That must make it hard to make friends, living like that." "I can't imagine such a nomadic life," she said. "Yeah, it can be tough," I admitted. "I've only lived in 2 places," she continued. "Here in Manhattan and at Princeton, where I go to school." "You're still in school?" I asked, surprised. "Yes, I have 1 year left at Princeton. I'm here as an unpaid summer intern." "That must be tough," I said, trying not to sound sarcastic. Katie didn't take offense. "Not really. My father believes in community service. He gives me an allowance and covers my tuition, so money's not an issue. When I graduate next spring, I'll try living on my own. For now, I'm focused on my studies and helping out here." "That sounds nice," I said, realizing it might have come off the wrong way. "Yeah, I'm lucky," Katie said, not taking it personally. "I have friends who struggle to pay tuition and rent. Having financial support makes being a student a lot easier." As Katie spoke, I realized how different she was from the wealthy people I had met at Wharton. In our 30-minute conversation, she expressed genuine concern for the girls in Sudan and for her classmates. Later, I learned that on the same day we met, she had been hit by a cab on her way to work. She had a large bruise on her thigh, but she didn't even mention it until days later. This was someone worth knowing. Before I could say anything, she surprised me. "Nick, you mentioned it's hard to make friends when you're always moving. Would you like to have dinner with me sometime?" "Of course," I replied without hesitation. That was the start of our friendship, which eventually grew into a relationship, one now threatened by her mother's manipulation. After leaving Jack's office, I returned home. When Katie walked in, she found dinner on the stove, a bottle of Merlot breathing, and a dozen red roses on the table. It took her a moment to notice the 3 place settings. "I see we're expecting guests." "Who's coming?" she asked, puzzled. "Your father," I said. "My father? What about my mother? Did something happen to her?" she asked, concerned. "No, nothing happened to your mother. Your father, and I just want to talk to you. Go wash up. He'll be here any minute." Right on cue, Jack rang the bell. I knew I couldn't hold Katie off much longer. My hopes for a calm, quiet dinner were, in hindsight, too idealistic. The wine was poured, and the pasta sat steaming on the plates, but as soon as we settled in, Katie cut right to the point. "Why is my father here without my mother?" she demanded, her voice tight with suspicion. Jack stepped in before I could respond, taking control of the conversation. He began explaining everything Margaret had been up to in recent months. The truth hit Katie like a storm. Her face crumbled, and she collapsed into sobs, repeating, "No, no, no." She was inconsolable until Jack moved to the couch with her, letting her cry into his chest. Sensing they needed a moment, I quietly retreated to clean up the kitchen, then took Baxter for a long walk. By the time I returned about half an hour later, Katie was waiting for me by the door, her eyes swollen and red from crying. "Nick, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please tell me you still want to be with me." I stepped closer, gently taking her hands in mine. "Katie, I never stopped wanting to be with you. My biggest fear was that you changed your mind, that you were done with us. But I see now, you were manipulated by your mother, and that's not your fault. I love you, and I never stopped." She exhaled shakily, her body relaxing just a little. "And my dad, he wants to fix things with me. He said he's afraid I'll keep my distance after everything with Mom. But he thinks we should focus on rebuilding our marriage first. He even suggested a trip to the Bahamas. He wants us to spend time together as a family." "That sounds perfect," I said, relief washing over me. "We can figure out the details later, but for now, let's take this one step at a time." With that, I reheated our dinner. The pasta wasn't exactly restaurant quality at that point, but none of us cared. We sat down again, the 3 of us sharing a quiet meal. It was the first small step toward healing. It took nearly a year before Jack could organize that vacation to the Bahamas, but in the meantime, he made a sincere effort to reconnect with Katie. Most weekends, he'd spend time with us, getting to know the daughter he now realized he should have bonded with years earlier. I could see it in his eyes. He was slowly coming to understand what I'd realized the day I first met Katie, that beneath her quiet exterior, she had a heart full of kindness and compassion. With Jack's steady presence in our lives, Katie began to recover from the betrayal she'd endured. Over the next few months, we worked hard on repairing our marriage. Knowing that Katie had never truly strayed from our relationship made all the difference. While Brad had tried to push boundaries, he'd chosen the wrong woman. Katie had stayed true, despite her mother's poisonous influence. Eventually, we took that week-long trip with Jack to Cat Island in the Bahamas. After I returned to work, Katie stayed on for a few extra days with her father. My work project wrapped up on time and under budget, which led to a promotion to IT director and a healthy bonus. Life was falling back into place. Katie even had to be convinced she could still rock a bikini on the beach, despite her post-pregnancy curves. Not long after our trip, our son, Paul Jonathan Parker, was born, named after both of his grandfathers. 2 years later, our daughter, Claire Emma Parker, joined us, Claire after my mother. Jack, now retired at 63, doted on his grandchildren, spoiling them at every opportunity. He even bought a small apartment nearby, a second home so he could be closer to the family he had once been too distant from. Unfortunately, things didn't end so well for Margaret. Jack divorced her soon after our dinner, and though it cost him a fortune in legal fees, the evidence of her manipulative behavior, along with her sizable trust funds, allowed Jack to walk away without paying alimony. He still retained enough of his assets to enjoy a comfortable retirement. As Margaret's scheming came to light, she became a social outcast. She moved to Palm Beach, but her reputation followed her. She was blacklisted from tennis clubs and spent nearly a year in Florida without making a single friend. After that, she relocated to Palm Springs, thinking the change in scenery would help. While she tried to mingle with the wealthy crowd there, She found herself competing with younger women for attention. Her solution was to turn to plastic surgery, but the results were disastrous, leaving her looking unnaturally altered. I only found out about her failed facelift 2 years after Claire was born, when Margaret showed up at our front door. I barely recognized her at first. I didn't bother opening the screen door. "Margaret, what are you doing here?" I asked bluntly, making no attempt to be kind. "I want to see Katie and my grandchildren," she said, her voice cracking. "You're not welcome here, Margaret," I said coldly. "No one in this house wants to see you. Now leave." She tried to push back, raising her voice. "You have no right to keep me from seeing them. Open this door." I shook my head. "You don't understand. Katie doesn't want to see you, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you don't infect our children with your bitterness." As I started to close the door, something made me pause. What happened to your face?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. Margaret froze, stunned by my question, as I shut the door in her face. She didn't give up easily, though. The next day, while I was at work, she called the house. Katie later told me the conversation had been brief. She had confirmed that Margaret was no longer welcome in our lives. Margaret even tried to bribe her, offering $10,000 per visit to the kids' college fund. Katie refused without hesitation. Margaret's desperation knew no bounds. She showed up at our children's daycare, which forced us to take out a restraining order. When she called Jack, he simply laughed and hung up. The last we heard, she had settled back in Palm Springs, living with a gigolo who had already bled her out of a significant chunk of her money. It was tragic, really, a fitting end for someone who had built her life around manipulation and control. Sometimes, life gives people exactly what they deserve. It reminded me of my final act against Brad Carson. Under an alias, I sent him a letter, a short, cutting poem. "Your lawyer said you were innocent, but the jury disagreed. For the crime that brought you down, justice found its need. I'm innocent," you cried again, "but karma had its way. Now you know, fool. You messed with the wrong prey."